If I could just ask you to introduce yourself and give your name, matriculation, subject, and your job status, Stuart. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, hi. Hi, I'm Stuart Faulkner. I'm a retired investment banker. I studied modern history at St Anne's and matriculated in 1991.
Brilliant. So we've got some questions from the JCR and students, some of which you've had in advance. I'll begin with asking, so you talked about being an investment banker. What inspired you to choose your career and how did you come to this role? And was your career trajectory planned or did it develop organically?
Very boringly, I wanted to be an investment banker from my mid-teens, and pretty much mapped out my career from that point, which included going to Oxford and studying history and focusing on the Wars of the Roses, which is slightly dull because that's exactly how things ended up rolling out for me. I grew up relatively poor. And one of the great things about investment banking, and people will talk about it's intellectually challenging and traveling the world and helping people solve problems and all of that. All of that is true, but it is one of the rare jobs where, as well as getting paid a salary, you can actually build up capital. And that was really attractive to me. That's why it won out over becoming a lawyer or a consultant, which are sort of the other very similar sort of businesses that you could go into at that time. So yeah, that was the main reason. There was a chap from Morgan Grenfell, which ended up being part of Deutsche Bank, who came down on the milk round, who laid that out actually with a wonderful graph showing, lawyer versus consultant versus banker, and showing, how our salaries were behind for a bit and then caught up, but showed with the bonuses, how different that was by the time you hit 30, and even more so by the time you hit 40. I think that's changed a bit. I think, particularly lawyers now, junior lawyers get paid way more than junior bankers, and partners at major law firms get pretty much the same as an MD at a big investment bank. That wasn't the case when I started out, so that has equalised, and I think that equalised because there was a requirement for smart people to carry on going into the law, and banking, certainly in the 80s and the 90s, was sucking out far too many people into what was an ever expanding number of banks.
Very interesting. And you mentioned about sort of the various elements of that role. What did a typical day at your job look like,
I
if there
think
was such a
split that
thing?
into two because it really changes between when you're a junior banker and when you're a more senior one. The senior one is, pretty much what you see in the TV shows. It's an awful lot of going out for lunch and an awful lot of going out for dinners and going to the theatre and the opera and, Glyndebourne, all those kind of things to schmooze clients. And it sounds great. It can be pretty brutal, particularly during the season, because you don't see much of your partner or your friends because you are out constantly doing that. But it's kind of a quite first world problem to complain about. As a junior banker, your day is really determined by what your boss wants you to be doing. And it's really, back in my day anyway, split between sort of three major core bits of work. One is financial modeling, two is preparing presentation, and three is coming up with ideas that the boss can go through and say, eight of these are rubbish, one of them's okay, and one of them's actually quite clever. I'm going to take that idea and go and do something interesting with it. What I think is going to fundamentally change for junior bankers, and is already changing for junior bankers, is the way AI is replacing large chunks of all of those workflows. And I think it is the experience I had was massively different to someone 30 years before me because even 10 years before me, financial models were done on a calculator and on long bits of paper and then put up on a pegboard. In the 80s. By the 90s, we all had computers, but the spreadsheets were very, very simple. Then you only had one tab on any of them. You had to press, calculate and go away and make a coffee and wait for 15 minutes. Anybody who worked in a university doing anything with large numbers in the physics department, the maths department, the engineering department will remember that in the 90s you set something running and then you went away for 15 minutes and you hoped it didn't crash and you hoped it worked and you hoped the answer looked like the answer you expected it to be. Banking was exactly the same. So different outputs from the models, but same architecture and same issues. So I think it's going to be a very different job for people leaving university in the next few years. And already, I see through friends who are still working, the requirement for less graduates And I think that pendulum has swung too far, and it will create a problem where suddenly these banks will look around and wonder where their VPs, either sort of mid-level, 10 years into banking career, people are who can hold a conversation with the client and have got a sufficient background in all of the other skill sets to be able to take that step up. Because whilst you can recreate a lot of the grunt work through AI, it does still hallucinate and produce some bonkers. And there's a Reddit page that I follow that just has some brilliant examples of that. But it it the main way that junior bankers learn is monkey see, monkey do. And if they are not there, or not there in numbers, and not in the office, and not able to bounce things off each other and see what the people above them are doing, you won't end up with well-rounded people. And you have to have a critical mass to have that. So I think it's going to be an interesting 10 years.
I'm just going to jump a few questions actually, because we had one which was
Sure.
related to AI. So it said, this person said, what opportunities for growth or advancement exist in your field? Is the landscape of this likely to change in the coming years as factors such as AI advancement alter the market? So you've answered part of that already, but
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about investment banking, and it doesn't matter which bit you're in, whether that's the trading floor or M&A advisory, which is what I did, through to debt, equities, fundraising, whatever, is it tracks the economy in a sort of parasitic and supportive way. In that, as the real world changes, banking changes to follow it. If you go back to the 70s and 80s, it was all about the conglomerates, the Hansons going around the world buying up businesses. Then it was about demerging. Then it was about dot coms. Then it was about private equity. Now we've got the AI rush coming through and everything that means for the tech field more generally. And each time one of those change, and private debt, which is probably going to be where the next big crash comes from. The next GFC won't come from the public markets; it will come from private debt. And each time, what is happening in the real world is reflected and accelerated by what happens in the banking world. It's why we've got a potential future prime minister of the UK flipping from saying I'm not going to be in hock to the bond markets when he had no chance of being prime minister, through to actually I'll work with the city when he's realised that he might become prime minister, because you can't ignore the financial world anymore. It is larger than most governments. US and China probably have the ability to a certain extent ignore the markets for a brief period of time. Countries like the UK do not. Even the EU, without fundamental reform, is not in a position to do that.
very interesting. And just going back to one of your points earlier, somebody asked, how do you balance your work life and personal life? You mentioned obviously in your role that you had to go out quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, this is one where I'm very generous of very jealous of the generation coming through. As a junior banker back in my day, the answer was you didn't have a personal life. It was that simple. I moved up with a bunch of friends because we all thought we were going to carry on rowing. We all moved to Putney in order to carry on rowing. Yeah, none of us saw daylight for a good 2 years. You know, my average hours as a junior banker, a good week was 100 hours in the office.
For 2 years.
Yeah. So the a good week would be 100 hours in the office. A bad week would be 120 hours plus. You regularly worked all-nighters where you worked all the way through and were there all the way through the next day. I've worked up to 70 hours before, straight without sleep. It was really brutal. And as a result of that, the only people you socialized with were incredibly close friends who would, permit you to turn up late to dinner parties and fall asleep in the corner, and very tolerant partners, and people who did the same job as you. So for a period of time, my friends, and I worked in London, Hong Kong in that period, were nearly all bankers, lawyers, consultants, or accountants doing deal work, because they were the only people who thought it would be completely normal to ring someone at 1 a.m. and say, hey, I'm getting out of the office. Do you fancy going to a club for 2 hours? I'm getting a car to pick me up at 4 because I'm going straight back into the office. That lifestyle is really hard. And then once you get out of the other side of that, you become more senior. It's the stress levels go up because you're managing other people. And investment bankers hate being managed. They really hate it. We're terrible at it. We're also terrible at appointing people to managers. We think the only people who should manage investment bankers are really good investment bankers. The problem with that is really good investment bankers are solipsistic, borderline sociopaths and are terrible at managing other people. And it's just a doom loop. And then when you get more senior, the stress is not the internal stress in managing people, although you do still have some of that. It's when your client wants you, you need to be available. And that is, you know, it doesn't matter when. I mean, a good example would be I'm very lucky to be married to a very tolerant woman for 25 years. We got married at 11 a.m. And I was still in the office that morning at 4 a.m. You know, that's, that was when I was at Merrill Lynch. And I was a director at that point, so relatively senior. But there was something big going on. The head of M&A from the States is over, wanted me working on it. You worked on it. I mean, he very nicely did get me a car home so I could get showered and changed to get 3 hours sleep. So, my boss ended up staying all the way through the night. So, it's really, really brutal, and I think it's less brutal now. And that's because there have been some high profile, kids dying at the desk type stuff. Google search Merrill Lynch was particularly bad for that. I think we had two in the space of 3 years. But it also causes really good people to burn out and self-select out because you can do this for 6 or 7 years and walk away with a few £100,000 in your pocket and go and do something that doesn't destroy you. And it's physically quite bad for you as well. There were some people who had quite bad physical reactions to it. Shingles, constant colds, flu, etc., etc. So that's largely, I hope, has largely gone. Yeah,
Mm.
so that sounded horrible. Having said all of that, there's great camaraderie. It's a huge amount of fun. I look back and I'd change very little of it. Maybe just take 20% off the hours.
You kind of answered some of the next questions. This one was, what do you enjoy most about your work? So you mentioned the camaraderie at the end. Was there anything else?
I think for me, it was the creativity.
Mm.
I focused on mergers and acquisitions, and every takeover or defense of a takeover is different. The people involved in different, the pressure points are different, and just finding a way to come up with something that is unique, that moves the dial, that changes a win to a loss or a loss to a win, depending which side of the fence you're on. That was really good fun. And it doesn't happen that often because you're sitting in a room with 100 people as brilliant as you are. But it's really satisfying when you come up with something, and it's really satisfying when the machine works, when the team really works, and quite often you're working with bankers from another bank. Big transactions, you'll have two or three banks working together. That can be the most horrible, sharp-elbowed experience of your life, or when it works, it's amazing. It's like seeing a football team when everybody knows where the other person's going to be, and the ball just pings, and the ideas just ping, and that can be fantastic.
Mm. And if you could go back, would you choose the same career again? Um, and
If I was
why
going
not?
back to the same time, I was making my choice in the 90s, absolutely. If I was doing it now, I think it's a more difficult one simply because I don't know what AI is going to do to the industry for the first 10 years I would be in that industry. And that to me is a little unsettling. You could start down this career route and then AI really takes off and really starts to work. And suddenly they only need 10% of the number of graduates that they're hiring now, which is already half of what they were hiring 5 years ago. So I probably wouldn't. I would choose something that I think would give me a lot of the similar challenges, wouldn't probably make me as comfortably off, which would be to be a barrister, because I think that is one of the last bastions of those professions that AI will get to. Because whilst it can run through all the precedents and all the court cases and all the rest of it, and it's very good at doing that, which is tough for junior lawyers. I think standing up and arguing your case in court, we're a long way away from ChatGPT doing that. Although it would be quite interesting to watch, Gemini and Claude have an argument over Roe versus Wade or something like that. But that would be really fun to set up. I'll just make a note of that. Someone must have done this already. One of your law students will know this, but there must be somewhere somebody doing moots using different AI large language models. If they
I'm sure
haven't,
someone.
suggest that to us. suggest that to one of the good lawyers that you've got there, and get him on it because he could make his name doing that.
And this is, sure, a question that you probably get a lot is what advice would you give someone interested in your profession? The student asked, in such a tough job market, what makes a candidate stand out to you in your profession?
Yeah, I think it's very easy for our generation to sit here and give all the answers about, do your internships and read up and study and all the rest of it. It is a lot harder for this generation than it was for mine. There are less jobs around. It is harder to stand out. We were lucky. The old school tie thing was largely gone by the time I was applying. It was incredibly meritocratic, and firms had the time and the inclination to take it seriously. Every investment bank that I got to at least the second round of was a 3 day somewhere in a hotel, you know, session. So you had multiple interviews, you had team building exercises, you had problem solving stuff. There were drinks in the evening where they could see what you were like socially. There were the drinks nights where they left you on your own to, to do whatever you want with an unlimited amount of alcohol. And then, quite clearly they got some feedback from that. Those kind of things showed that the firms really cared and had a process for doing it. Now, I think it's really difficult to differentiate yourself because everybody's using AI. What I would suggest is do use it. I'm not only one of those to say don't, but then rewrite everything it produces so it sounds like you. And the way I would suggest you do this, and I can talk to this quite I have to be quite careful. My niece and nephew are currently going through university applications, and there's some similarities there. But what they are doing is with a close friend, they are basically, when they have done their first draft, they're rewriting it as them, they're reading it to each other to see if it sounds like how the other person normally sounds like. Because if you can't get your true, authentic voice across, you will just sound like another robot AI application, and you won't even get to the interview. You won't get to the interview with a banker. You'll get to an interview with an HR functionary who is, be very blunt, no more than the filter system. Um, Try and, much like when you're doing your first tutorial, try and mark out what makes you feel special, what you're really good at, what you're interested in, what you're passionate about. If you are more minded to the mathematical side of it, talk about that. If you're more minded to the social side of it, talk about that. If you have a contrary view, bankers love being told that we're terrible people and we cause damage to the world. It's you can stand out doing that. So I hired someone who's still well, now works for the Qatari Investment Authority, so the head of M&A there. But I remember interviewing him, and he said, "Do you realise of the deals that you've done in the last 5 years, 36% of them have destroyed value?" And we had a brilliant, stop being an interview, we had a brilliant discussion about that. He'd gone away and done his homework. He discovered who was going to be interviewing him. And he basically came and trashed over a third of my deals. It did point out to him we get paid whether they're successful or not. But something like that stands out actually. That's a real diamond moment. Someone who found a way just to turn that from being an interview into being a discussion. Do the summer vac. They'll know all of this stuff, but do the summer vac things. The Oxford University Career Service used to be brilliant. I suspect it still is brilliant at doing that. It is a better way in than knowing somebody's father's uncle or something like that. On the whole, read a lot around the subject, but also, I don't mean all the boring stuff. The FT and The Economist, if you're not actually doing the job, they're really dull to read, and a lot of it won't make a huge amount of sense. Whereas if you go and watch The Big Short, a film like that, or um, Margin Call, or go and read Barbarians at the Gate, those kind of semi-fictionalized or certainly genned up. They tell a story and they explain what bankers do in a way better way than you'll pick up reading the FT or the takeover panel or an IPO manuscript.
It's very interesting. Another person asked about education or training, and it kind of relates. Is there any
Hmm.
additional education or training that you needed?
Yeah. So, as I said, I did modern history, mainly focused on the Wars of the Roses, which I deeply loved. I'm lucky enough that my tutor from back then still sends me a reading list. But you have to qualify. So you have to get what in my day was called the Regi Rep, the FCA. I think it's FSA now, registration. It's a bunch of exams. You'll typically do it 3 months after you join the firm. And if you don't pass the first time, you'll get a couple of weeks of reset. And then if you don't pass the second time, you get fired. They're really easy. You study for them. You're given a bit of time to study for them, but it is around the rest of your work. Um, there are various other qualifications you can get. I became a fellow of the Chartered Institute for Securities. That had a few exams, but none of the exams. Oh, and Series 7, which is my New York Stock Exchange qualification, because I wanted to work in the States. None of them are particularly difficult. It's just finding the time to do them. It's a lot easier than studying for the bar or studying for accountancy exams. They tend to be a lot more real life focused as well. Whereas I think particularly on the law side, a lot of it can be quite dry and not directly relevant to what you're going to be doing in your day-to-day life. Most of the learning though is on the job. And I found actually some of the most useful stuff wasn't from my banks wherever I was working, but was actually to go to what the lawyers were being taught at Slaughter and May and Freshfields. They will quite happily open up the floor to bankers to go along because it builds a relationship. The junior banker's in a room with the junior lawyer. Next time he needs to, get a lawyer, he'll call that person and 15 years later, you're an MD, he's a partner, and that's the guy you do most of your M&A deals with. So out of small acorns, those oaks grow. But I learned a lot more going to those legal ones than I did any of the ones that my bank ran.
Interesting. Um, what mistakes should students avoid when planning their careers, if any?
I
It's a
think,
tricky.
again, it's much harder to plan a career these days than it was even in my days. I mean, I look back at my parents' generation where you went to work for a firm and you worked there for 35 years. They found the fact that I moved banks 7 times completely mystifying to them. In the same way, I imagine that kids coming out of university now will find the idea that I stayed in one business doing M&A for 30 years mystifying. I think constantly be aware what your skills are useful for outside of the job channel that you're in. Because we all hear the word pivot far too often. But I think it is very much true that the coming generation will need to have 2 or 3 different careers. Stay abreast of whatever technology is driving things forward. It's AI at the moment. What will it be next? Low Earth orbit is probably something that I would be looking at. Anything to do with nanotechnology, it keeps almost getting there, not quite getting there. Cold fusion, alternative power sources, all those kind of things. Think about how those things are going to change the job you're doing. And also always think, is this the job I want to be doing? I was very lucky. I spent most of my career loving what I did, but some of my friends who didn't sat down and went, right, what am I good at? What has this job taught me? What can I go and do instead? And went and did completely different things that made them really happy. So don't be afraid to self-interrogate yourself and go, actually, do you know what? This is stupid. I don't want to be putting on a suit and going into London every day. I want to make bespoke cheeses in Wales or whatever it may be. Go back to university and teach. You know, that was something at my lowest ebb I gave serious thought to. Um, so keep self-interrogating and assume that things will change.
Okay, great. These are a couple of questions to finish on more about your time at university. So someone asked, what do you, if anything, wish you'd taken more advantage of during time at university, and what would you recommend students do now while they're at university to help them in the future?
I'm not sure I could have taken any more advantage of the fact that beer was 70p a pint than I did. Um, I would probably have tried a little harder at some of my sports, particularly the squash side, where I think I could have been a much better player with not a huge amount more application. I wish I had gone to more lectures, which is just such a shockingly geeky thing to say. But at the time, there's always a million other things that you can do with your friends, and particularly doing a history degree where you can always just go and read a book, and that's as good as the lectures. But I actually realized I missed out on hearing some really inspirational people speak that I could have done easily and for free. Whereas now, well, not now because I'm in New Zealand now, but up until 4 years ago, I used to come back regularly for the James Ford lectures, that are held in January, and realize how much I enjoy just listening to people who are brilliant at what they do, be passionate about it, and teach me new stuff. Whereas actually quite often I'd make the choice to go to the pub or go and lie in Port Meadow or go shopping on Little Trendy Street or go and read a book when actually I could have been listening to these people. And that's one thing I would change.
And then just to finish, two quite simple questions. One is, what was your proudest moment at Oxford?
Gosh, that's one from left field. That's an excellent question. If that was somebody in an interview, I would be very interested in carrying on talking to them. Um, Actually, slightly tongue in cheek because I don't have a ready answer to that. Getting in for me, because
Okay,
um, I didn't get in the first year. I reapplied and went through clearing and still didn't get in. I reapplied a year later, having got my A levels, didn't get into my first three choices, and went into clearing again. So thank you, St Anne's, effectively my eighth choice college, for
wow.
which I am very, 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 very grateful because it was an awesome place to be. Actually, that's probably it. The proudest thing was being at St Anne's. Because it was a brilliant college, the male female mix, the vibe to it, and everything. For someone who was a grammar school boy on the make, it was less intimidating than the experience some of my friends went through at some of the greater and better known colleges. And I had an amazing time there, and many of my closest friends are still from those days. So yeah, actually, my proudest Oxford moment would be being at St Anne's.
It's interesting you should say that because I was talking to a student yesterday, and their response was very similar to that. So it's nice that people are still saying that now, which is good. And then the last question, which is what is or was your favorite place in Oxford,
Ooh,
if it indeed still exists as
probably
the
it's
city
long gone
changed?
now, but it was the pub opposite St Anne's called the Horse and Jockey, which was nicknamed the Horse and Secchi because the girls from the Secretarial College drank there as well. But it was the first pub that had really big screens that showed what was then the Five Nations rugby on there. And it's now that bunch of flats next to um, or directly opposite as you come out of the where the main gate is. So all of that on the
Wow.
corner used to be a pub. Um,
Okay.
and I still think the little shop is still there where you can get overpriced butter, cheese, and bread at ridiculous times of the day. But probably there, and then the Bodleian because it's the Bodleian, right? It's an amazing place to sit, read, and work, and your access to pretty much any book in the world and manuscript is amazing too. So yeah, the two ends of the Oxford experience: the pub and the library.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Stuart. That was very interesting, and hopefully students will find it very useful.
Good. Well, thank you. And last message is best of luck. I think it's a tough time for you all, and just do your best and don't worry. Oh, yeah, I guess that'll be the last thing. Have a contingency plan as well. I signed up to do the JET scheme, which teaching English in Japan, would have been fantastic. Loved it. One of my friends, another alum from St Anne's, Danny, he's coming over from Japan at the end of the month. He went and did the jet scheme. He's now married to Keiko and has been living there for 35 years. That
Oh,
wasn't
wow.
what he intended to do. That was his contingency plan, and it turned out to be the best plan in the world for him. So have a few contingency plans. Don't be afraid to take time off to make a decision, and don't jump for the first person who offers you a job just because the salary looks nice. Make sure you want to do it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Stuart.